Well, it's a very big challenge still for countries like Georgia and those in the neighbourhood to really establish themselves as members of the international community. Georgia, just like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, all the other countries around, have had a very hard time over the last 20 years of differentiating themselves from the post-Soviet space. There's still this kind of idea that they're Russia's neighbourhood or they're the former Soviet states. And really, it's getting to that next level of being known as Georgia or Armenia or Azerbaijan that's part of a broader international community that's the biggest challenge. And that means differentiating yourself as a country, establishing a brand, establishing a reputation and establishing new relationships. And obviously that's something that Georgia has been trying very hard to do for 20 years now. New relationships with the European Union, with the United States, with NATO, with all the other immediate neighbours, Turkey, many other countries. But this remains, I think, really the biggest challenge of what is the country of Georgia, what are the other neighbouring countries going to be in the future, what role are they going to play, and how are they going to basically describe themselves as international players. I think that's true at all. I think part of the problem that Georgia has faced over the last several years that we were just talking about, trying to differentiate itself, has been in this continual struggle to pull itself away from the immediate orbit of Russia. But this doesn't necessarily mean that Russia and Georgia are fated to have bad relationships, and I think the real danger that we got into over the last decade in particular was that the definition of a new independent Georgia seemed to be in opposition to Russia. And Russia remains Georgia's largest, most immediate neighbour. And what Georgia has to do now is to find a way of normalising that relationship. It's differentiated itself from Russia, it's independent from the Soviet Union. It's established over time that it has the right to have an independent relationship and make its own decisions about its foreign policy and its associations with other countries, the kinds of relationships that it wants to enter into with other countries. But it now has to find a new footing for a relationship with Russia. And it's not in the United States' interest for Georgia and Russia to remain in a confrontational relationship as they were in 2008 with the war. There's no way that that was something that the United States had sought. It became, sadly, in the way that it was discussed in the region, a kind of proxy war between Russia and the United States over the future of Georgia, when really it's all about Georgia being able to define its own fate and decide itself about which direction it's going to go into. And if that requires then regularising the relationship with Russia, the United States would definitely support that. I don't think there's any question that the United States would oppose a normalisation of the relationship between Russia and Georgia. It's inevitable that Georgia has to find a way of dealing with Russia. It was always a long-term dream, and if we look at so many other countries, it's taken a very long time for them to go onto the trajectory of NATO or EU membership. Turkey is the most obvious case, not for NATO, but certainly for the European Union. It's been in some candidacy or accession talks for decades at this particular point. It certainly seems that with the EU, that countries like the Baltic states had a much quicker trajectory into the EU. And I think that is definitely the case because, of course, the Baltic states had never been recognised as being part of the Soviet Union after World War II. So there was obviously a boost that was given to those states. But for the most part, it's always a long path. And it's dependent on so many things, including not just the political issues, territorial disputes that have to be resolved, but also the convergence of economies. And I think we've seen with the Eurozone crisis and all of the problems that we've had in the European Union over the last several years, that given the entry of countries like Greece and Cyprus into the EU under terms that are now being questioned as to whether their economies or their political systems were quite ready for this, that it will always take an awfully long time, because although there is still an enlargement perspective for the European Union, there's now a lot of discussion about the whole future of Europe itself. When we look down through the next decade, I don't think that the European Union is going to look like the European Union of the past either. And they may, in fact, be the exit of the United Kingdom. That's at least an issue that's on the agenda now, even if it isn't inevitable. There's questions about whether there'll be different levels of association, whether you have to be in the core of the Eurozone to be part of the European Union. So all of those questions themselves will take some time to be sorted out. So it's not that it will never be in the perspective, but that it's just inevitably going to be a very long process. I think, in my view, it was perhaps the unrealistic expectations of how fast things could happen. There was also the way in which membership in NATO and the EU, for example, were talked about the idea that the first initial steps, either association agreements to the European Union or a membership action plan for NATO, were the thresholds that one crossed for immediate entry. These were just initial steps. And I think the rhetoric about the significance of those kinds of agreements was heightened to such a point that there were unrealistic expectations on every side. And of course, we know that those provoked then a backlash from Russia, because they were presented in many respects as if a membership action plan for NATO in particular, going back to 2008, were already tantamount to entry into the NATO as an organisation, when this was just the next step up from the Partnership for Peace arrangements, just the beginning of a process. And I think that really was at the root of some of the mistakes and miscalculations that were made in handling these very important relationships. I also have to say, quite frankly, that I think it was a mistake of previous Georgian governments, and I take this right back to the beginning of Georgian independence, to put so much emphasis on the bilateral relationship with the United States. Even though I'm talking from the perspective of the United States now, and obviously having a good bilateral relationship with the United States was an important achievement for Georgia. Georgia is in a very complex region. The United States is at a great distance. And what Georgia really needed to do is to figure out the relationships with its immediate neighbourhood, with its neighbours of Armenia and Azerbaijan, of being part of the Caucasus, to find out a new way of putting the relationship with Russia on a footing, not one that was in juxtaposition or in any kind of opposition to the relationship with the United States. Those relationships did not have to be mutually exclusive. And figuring out also relationships with Turkey as another immediate neighbour, and then, very importantly, Europe. Not just the European Union, but the whole range of European states. Georgia would have been very well served initially to have had a much more comprehensive approach to its foreign policy. And of course, it's very difficult to say in hindsight how a lot of things could have been differently. But had I been setting out as a Georgian diplomat or as a Georgian official, a Georgian strategic thinker at the very beginning, I would have tried to have a much more comprehensive approach to Georgia's set of relationships. I think it's Georgia has made a huge number of achievements over the last 20 years of independence. And Georgia really has been on a very strong trajectory towards pluralising and opening up its political space, really trying to regulise its economic situation, and trying to find new and innovative ways of governing itself. I think the trajectory for democratic development is a very long one. If you look back at the United States and most European countries, there are many ups and downs in the progress of democratisation. The United States civil rights movement, for example, bringing the full participation of the whole population into politics was an extremely long process, and is one that has only really been fully accomplished, I would say, perhaps with the election of Barack Obama. With a black man as President of the United States, really making it very clear that now anyone can achieve the highest office in the country.